The Vampire King's baby wouldn't stop crying on the transatlantic flight until she offered her own breast. The silence that followed wasn't just relief. It was acclaiming. What the woman didn't know was that the man holding that child was a monarch of the night, and the milk she just offered carried the rare, golden blood his dying heir had been starving for. Hi, my beautiful family. Thank you for sticking around with me through our trying times. I really appreciate your love and support. We're finally back again to give you many more beautiful stories. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe. Also drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The baby's scream cut through the pressurized cabin like a sonic drill. Leora Vale pressed her palms against her temples, but it was useless. 3 rows ahead in first class, a man with striking silver hair and a velvet coat was rocking an infant who seemed determined to shatter every window on the flight from New York to London. The red-eye, the expensive ticket she couldn't really afford, all bought for a moment of peace before facing her debts. So much for that plan. "Sir, please," a flight attendant whispered, her voice tight with panic. "The other passengers are agitated." "I am trying." The man's voice was baritone, smooth, but there was a jagged edge to it. Not anger, terror. "She won't take the bottle." The baby's cries intensified. Not the normal wail of a hungry infant, but something feral, a desperate, hollow sound, like the child was fading out of existence. Leora unbuckled her seatbelt. Around her, passengers were grumbling, pulling blankets over their heads. An older man in a suit hissed, "Can't you control your own brat?" The man didn't respond. He just kept rocking the bundle, his movements rigid. His knuckles were white where they gripped the velvet blanket. Something was wrong. Leora was a mother. She knew the difference between a tantrum and starvation. This was starvation. She stood up in the aisle. "Ma'am, the seatbelt sign is on," the attendant warned as Leora stepped past her. "Just 1 second." Leora approached the man with the dying baby. Up close, his appearance was arresting, sharp, aristocratic features, skin like marble, and dark glasses hiding his eyes. The baby in his arms was tiny, her skin possessing a sickly, grayish pallor. "Excuse me," Leora said softly. The man's head snapped toward her. For just a moment, he lowered his glasses, and she saw eyes that were rimmed with red, flashing with something that made her breath catch. Not hostility exactly. More like a predator cornered. Then the mask slid back into place. "I apologize," he said, his accent vaguely European. "She is unwell." "That's not." Leora hesitated. She looked at the formula bottle untouched on the tray. "Is she hungry?" The man went completely still. "She refuses everything. She is fading. The way she's crying. It's hunger pain." "I know it." Leora's hand went instinctively to her chest. Her own weaning had been recent. The instinct was still raw. "I can help. I'm a mother." For a long moment, the man just stared at her. The baby kept screaming, a sound that grated against the bones. Finally, the man gave a single, desperate nod. Leora knelt in the aisle beside his wide leather seat. The baby's eyes were squeezed shut, her tiny mouth opening and closing in a search for sustenance. She could see the blue veins pulsing frantically in the infant's temple. Poor thing was starving to death. Slowly, deliberately, Leora did the unthinkable. She unbuttoned her white blouse. She didn't think about the social taboo or the strangers watching. She thought only of the child. "Give her to me," she whispered. She reached out. The man hesitated, then passed the bundle over. The moment the infant touched Leora's skin, the baby thrashed, turning inward. Leora guided the child to her breast. "Latch." The baby's cries cut off instantly. Leora gasped. It wasn't a gentle pull, it was a vacuum, a desperate draw that seemed to pull from the very marrow of her bones. The cabin went silent, save for the hum of the engines and the rhythmic, ravenous sound of the baby feeding. "Holy!" Someone whispered behind her. The man holding the blanket looked like he'd been struck by lightning. He wasn't watching the baby, he was watching Leora. Specifically, the vein in her neck. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring as if he smelled something intoxicating. How? He couldn't seem to finish the sentence. She just needed something warm, Leora whispered, feeling a sudden, intense wave of dizziness. The drain was faster, harder than anything she'd experienced with her own son. Something real. The baby's eyes opened. They were the most unusual color Leora had ever seen, shifting from a cloudy blue to a glowing, vibrant crimson, fixed directly on Leora's face. Your blood, the man murmured, his voice barely audible, vibrating with awe. You are RH null. What? Leora blinked, her vision blurring slightly. My blood type? Yes, golden blood. How did you know? Because the man cut her off, his tone suddenly shifting from desperate to commanding. She has accepted you. I'm glad I could help. Leora tried to pull back, to break the latch, but the baby was incredibly strong. She stopped crying. You can take her back now. No, the man said. It wasn't a request. Leora looked up confused. The baby made a small sound, a satisfied purr, and Leora felt a strange, cold sluggishness spreading through her limbs. Sir, Leora said, I need to return to my seat. I am afraid that is no longer possible. The man didn't look at her. He looked at the reflection of the cabin in the window. He pulled out a sleek, black phone and typed a single message. Found her. The golden source. Prepare the nursery. And Leora definitely didn't see the flight attendant, who had been glaring moments ago, check her own phone and lock the cockpit door. Course diverted. Alps arrival in 40 minutes. The plane hummed through the night sky. The baby, finally at peace, fed with a terrifying strength against Leora's chest. And Leora Vale tried very hard to ignore the feeling that her entire life had just ended, and something else, something darker, had just begun. The descent was silent, the previous chaos of the cabin replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. Leora was still kneeling in the aisle, the infant Aria's small mouth fixed tightly against her breast. The sucking sensation was now less ravenous, more sustained, like a small, cold current continuously drawing energy from deep within her. The subtle red glow that had briefly illuminated Aria's eyes had faded, leaving them a startlingly clear sapphire blue, beautiful and innocent. The fear, however, was far from gone. It had simply shifted, settling into the cold pit of Leora's stomach. King Eric Violin, imposing even while hunched in the first-class seat, did not speak again until the landing gear thumped into position. He gently placed his velvet coat over Leora's exposed shoulder, his fingers brushing her neck for a fleeting, unsettling moment. It was not a comforting touch. It felt like a jeweler examining a rare stone. We are here, he stated, his voice low and devoid of the previous panic. Here was not JFK or Heathrow. When the cabin door hissed open, the only thing outside was darkness, snow-dusted tarmac, and the deafening roar of a massive engine idling nearby. Through the thick glass, Leora saw floodlights illuminating a secluded, mist-shrouded mountain range, the jagged, silent majesty of the Swiss Alps. A crew of men, dressed in severe black uniforms and carrying what Leora instantly recognized as professional-grade weapons, moved with paramilitary precision to surround the plane. My security detail, Eric said, noticing her gaze. He scooped Aria gently from Leora's arms, and for the first time since their terrifying bonding, the baby whimpered in protest. Aria reached a tiny, demanding hand back toward Leora. She is well fed for now. Leora felt a sudden, profound emptiness where the baby had been, a physical ache that was entirely separate from relief. It felt less like handing over a stranger's child and more like having a part of her own body removed. You can't just land a passenger plane in the middle of a private field, Leora protested, her voice raspy. This is illegal. Where are we? I need to get home. I have a son. Eric stood, towering over her. Legality is a human construct, Leora. One that rarely applies to kings. He nodded toward the waiting figures. You will be escorted. The escort was quick, cold, and inescapable. Leora was moved down the steps and into the brutal cold. She was not offered a coat. Her fellow passengers were already deplaning quietly, their faces pale and their eyes avoiding her. They were all ushered into separate, black vehicles. She was alone with Eric and his armed guards. Your belongings will be secured, Eric told her as he guided her toward a sleek, black limousine that looked like it had been carved from obsidian. Arya needs to be stabilized in the nursery. Once inside the soundproof car, the pretense of courtesy vanished. The windows were tinted opaque black. Eric sat across from her, holding the quiet Arya. He was no longer the desperate father. He was the king. Leora Vale, he began, his red-rimmed eyes finally meeting hers. You have committed an act of unbelievable fortune for my house. You saved my daughter. But you do not understand the true nature of your donation. Leora wrapped her arms around herself, shivering as much from fear as from the sudden chill that seemed to emanate from him. I gave her my milk. She was starving. I don't need fortune, I need a flight back to New York. No, Eric said flatly. You gave her your blood. That is what she was starving for. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. I am Eric Violin. I rule the oldest and most powerful coven of the night. And Arya is my daughter and heir. She is a damper. Half human, half vampire. Leora's mind struggled to catch up. Vampire. Damper. The red eyes, the strange, draining chill, the unnatural strength of the infant. It was too insane to be fiction. It had to be the truth. Vampires are real, she whispered. They are, he confirmed, sounding bored by the obvious. Arya's mother, my beloved wife, Isabella, was human. Her body, like yours, carried the Rh0 blood type. The golden blood. He spoke the term like a prayer. This rare blood carries a dense, vital energy. It is the only thing that sustains the damper when their vampire side first awakens. He gestured to Arya. Until a damper reaches maturity, regular human food sustains the body, but the vital energy, the life force, must come from this rare source, or they simply waste away. Isabella carried her for 9 months and fed her for a month before she died. Leora felt a wave of crushing guilt. She died because of this? Because of the drain. Eric's jaw tightened. She died in childbirth, not from the drain. But since then, Arya has rejected every attempt at substitution, every wet nurse, every donor, every formula. She was hours from starvation, from fading entirely. He reached across the space, his pale, strong hand gripping her wrist. His touch was cold enough to sting. You did not offer milk, Leora. You offered a binding contract. The golden blood is what saved her. It is what she is now bound to. She has claimed you as her source. And, because she is the royal heir, you belong to the House of Violin now. He released her wrist and looked at her with chilling finality. You are the new source. It is not a request. Until Arya is stabilized, until she is safe, you will remain here. You are the only one who can keep my daughter alive. The drive from the remote airstrip was a blur of black windows and ascending mountain passes. When the limousine finally slowed, it was before wrought iron gates taller than any building Leora had ever seen. They swung open onto a long, winding gravel drive leading to what could only be described as a storybook nightmare. Violin Manor was not a house. It was a Gothic fortress, a sprawling edifice of dark gray stone, spires, and pointed arches, silhouetted against the unforgiving backdrop of the Alps. The sheer scale and ancient, hostile beauty of the place stole the air from Leora's lungs. Inside, the manor was a cavern of polished marble floors and vaulted ceilings draped in shadow. Chandeliers the size of small cars cast flickering light on tapestries depicting battles and crests Leora didn't dare try to interpret. Eric, regal and distant, carried Arya toward a hidden section of the estate, leaving Leora with a stern, imposing woman introduced only as Madame Costia, the head of household. "Follow me, Miss Vale," Madame Costia instructed, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. "The king has designated the royal wet nurse accommodations." The accommodations were, to Leora's stunned disbelief, the late Queen Isabella's own suite. It was a space designed for opulence and sorrow, a massive four-poster bed draped in crimson velvet, a private parlor with antique furniture, and a bathroom larger than Leora's entire apartment back home. Yet, despite the luxury, the air was heavy with grief and disuse. Leora heard the muffled whispers immediately from the discreet, black-clad staff who materialized and dissolved like smoke. The Queen's suite for a human source? A new feeding machine? The title Royal Wet Nurse sounded less like an honor and more like an unpleasant, temporary utility. The isolation was instant. She was a jewel in a gilded cage, precious only for what she produced. Later that evening, after being offered a meal she couldn't touch, Leora finally met the head of security, a powerfully built vampire named Casimir. He was skeptical, cold, and utterly distrustful. "Your blood type is confirmed, Ms. Vale," he stated, leaning against the doorframe as she tried to unpack the single carry-on bag she still possessed. "Your presence here is necessary. But know this. You are a civilian in a military establishment. You do not move without escort. You do not speak to anyone outside the immediate household staff. Your role is purely biological." "And what about my life?" Leora demanded, whirling around. The fear had finally curdled into indignation. "I have a life. I have a son back home. I didn't sign up to be a prisoner or a dairy cow." Casimir's expression was unmoved. "The king will handle your affairs. For now, you are the most valuable asset in the realm. We will ensure your safety and your output. Nothing else matters." Left alone again, Leora realized the depth of her predicament. The gilded cage was very real. She paced the velvet carpet, searching for a phone, an exit, anything. The windows were either locked tight or looked out onto a sheer, terrifying drop. When Eric finally came to her suite hours later, he found her staring out the window, tears of frustration streaming down her face. "I need to go home, Eric," she pleaded, using his first name defiantly. "I understand the danger to Arya, but I have obligations. You cannot simply steal me away." He approached her, a silent, powerful presence. "Leora, I can. And I have. My enemies would destroy us both if they learned you existed outside these walls." "Then let's make a deal," she said, desperate. "Tell me your terms. I can pump. I can provide the milk, the blood, whatever it is. You don't have to keep me hostage." Eric listened patiently, then sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weariness of centuries. "You do not understand the bond. It is not like donating blood, Leora. It must be live. Sustained." He paused, then added in a quieter voice, "But you are right. You have a right to know the terms." He stepped back and snapped his fingers. Immediately, a side door Leora hadn't noticed opened, revealing a small, stark medical room. In the center of the room, under sterile lighting, lay Arya. Leora gasped. The baby was pale again, the subtle, healthy coloring she had gained on the plane completely gone. She looked translucent, frail. She was whimpering, a tiny, distressed sound that was barely audible. She was hooked up to several monitors, and a nurse was frantically trying to administer some kind of for. "We brought her up 5 hours ago," Eric explained, his voice low and painful. "The vitality from your blood has already been burned through. Her body is demanding more. No known human nourishment will suffice. Only you." He walked over and gently touched his daughter's hand. "Look at her, Leora. She is starving again. The human part of her is dying, and if the human part dies, the vampire part will follow. I have lost my wife. I cannot lose my daughter." Leora forgot the cell phone, the confinement, the luxury suite, and the skeptical staff. All the political intrigue and the terror of the supernatural world dissolved, leaving only one sharp, undeniable maternal urge. Arya was a baby, and Arya was dying. Leora rushed to the crib, reaching for the infant. The moment Arya was in her arms, the tiny whimpers stopped. Leora opened her blouse, tears streaming down her face now for the child, not for herself. As Arya latched on, a faint glow of red briefly sparked in the baby's eyes. When she finished, Arya's color was restored. The baby fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Leora looked up at Eric, her exhaustion complete, but her purpose crystallized. 30 days, she whispered, her voice firm. I will stay for 30 days. I will stabilize her, and you will give me passage home, safe and sound, with enough money to care for my son. Eric watched the child, then met Leora's gaze, a flicker of something close to respect in his red-rimmed eyes. 30 days. A stabilization contract. Very well, Leora Vale. You have my word as king. It was a contract made in fear, desperation, and motherhood. Leora knew instantly that she would not be leaving in 30 days, but for the sake of the fragile life in her arms, she had to pretend she believed him. The 30-day contract began to bleed Leora dry long before the first week was out. Arya was thriving, her pale skin gaining a healthy luminescence, her crimson eyes gleaming with strength. But every time Arya fed, Leora felt a profound, chilling emptiness in return. It was more than the physical loss of milk, it was the drain of vital energy Eric had described. She woke up with headaches that pounded behind her eyes, the ornate velvet curtains doing little to block the crushing sensitivity to the manor's dim lighting. The rich, heavy meals offered by Madame Kostya turned to dust in her mouth. She was perpetually cold, shivering even under the thick, European down duvets, and her own reflection in the gold-trimmed mirror was alarming. Her skin was transparent, her lips were chapped and colorless, and the dark circles under her eyes looked bruised. She was literally wasting away, her own life force being consumed to keep the royal heir alive. One night, Leora collapsed trying to stand up from Arya's bedside. The darkness wasn't just in the room. It rushed into her head, thick and blinding. She crumpled to the marble floor, the scent of antiseptic and cold stone rushing up to meet her. When she woke, she was back in the enormous bed, tucked under the heavy velvet. Eric was sitting beside her, not in his usual posture of regal detachment, but leaning forward, his brow furrowed with genuine alarm. You have underestimated the toll, Leora, he stated, his voice a low, heavy rumble. The golden blood is potent, but the demand of a damper air is exponential. You are burning through your resources too quickly. Leora managed a raspy whisper. I told you. I'm not built for this. I need to leave before I'm just an empty shell. You will not leave, Eric said, his tone softening only slightly. You are valuable, and I will not allow my source to fail. Casimir has failed to monitor your intake properly. He stood and went to the heavy wooden cabinet in the corner, retrieving a small, crystalline glass filled with a liquid that glowed faintly, like liquid bronze in the dim light. This is unacceptable. We must compensate for the drain, he announced, returning to the bedside. You will begin taking restorative tonics. Vampire alchemy, specially formulated to replenish your life force and stabilize the blood loss. Leora eyed the glowing liquid with suspicion. What is in it? Everything your body lacks, and more, he replied, holding the glass out. Drink it. She hesitated, then realized she had no choice. She took the glass, brought it to her lips, and swallowed the tonic in one go. It tasted like metallic honey and burnt spices. It made her gag slightly, but almost instantly, she felt a wash of heat spread through her limbs, chasing away the bone-deep cold. Her heartbeat, which had been a frantic flutter, slowed to a steady, strong rhythm. The difference was startling, terrifyingly effective. Days turned into another week. The tonic kept her alive, but the drain was continuous, leaving her perpetually on the edge of depletion. The constant, extreme physical intimacy of feeding Arya while keeping the king's formal distance created an unbearable tension between Eric and Leora. He would stand vigil while she nursed, watching her face, observing the precise moment the color drained, assessing his precious resource. The true breaking point came during the second week. Leora had not been able to keep the tonic down one morning. By the time Arya's hunger began in the pre-dawn hours, Leora was violently weak, dizzy, and clammy. As Arya nursed, Leora felt the sudden, agonizing sensation of her consciousness pulling away from her body. Eric noticed instantly. He cursed under his breath, a sharp sound of frustration, and ripped the baby gently from her. "No, no, you are crashing," he muttered, dropping the infant back into the safety of the crib. He was moving quickly now, his usual cold control shattered by a sudden, fierce panic. He pulled a small silver flask from his coat, not the crystal glass of tonic, but something else entirely. He uncorked it, and Leora recognized the thick, coppery scent immediately. "Blood. This is vital," he stated, his red eyes burning with urgency. "The alchemy is too slow now. You need immediate, pure replenishment." He poured a stream of the dark, viscous liquid into a wine glass on the nightstand. "Drink this. Now." Leora shrank back against the pillows. "No, I won't. I can't." The thought of drinking pure blood, vampire blood, revolted her. "It is mine," Eric said, his voice low and compelling. He held the glass to her lips. "It is the only thing that will anchor your soul back to your body, Leora. Arya needs you whole. Do not be a fool." Leora had just enough presence of mind to understand that he was not threatening her, he was demanding her survival. With a trembling hand, she grasped the glass and forced herself to swallow the substance. It was hot, electric, and unbelievably rich. It flooded her system, not with the chemical stabilization of the tonic, but with raw, surging power. The cold fled, replaced by a feverish warmth. She felt a strength she hadn't possessed in years. But the physical exchange was not the only consequence. As Eric's blood rushed through her veins, it tore open a psychic barrier. Suddenly, she wasn't looking at Eric Violent's face, but at a woman with midnight hair and a mischievous, loving smile, Isabella. She saw Eric laughing, a sound rich with human joy, as he held a pregnant Isabella close in a sun-drenched garden. The vision was brief, immediate, and utterly heartbreaking. It was a memory. His memory. Leora gasped, pushing the empty glass away. "What was that? What did I just see?" Eric's own face was pale with shock, his composure utterly broken. "The exchange. My blood, it has created a temporary link," he stammered, running a hand through his silver hair. "You saw Isabella. You saw my wife." He had inadvertently allowed Leora past his royal shield, sharing the very essence of his grief and his greatest love. The emotional contract was now as tangible as the physical one. Leora realized the king hadn't just saved her life. He had initiated an intimacy that neither of them could take back. She no longer just possessed his daughter's life. She now possessed the indelible ghost of his past. The psychic shock of the blood exchange left Leora shaky, yet strangely invigorated. She felt Eric's presence more acutely now, and the spectral vision of Isabella haunted the edges of her awareness. She knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that the king was genuinely grieving, and that the precious, fragile life of Arya was his only remaining anchor. This connection deepened Leora's commitment, transforming her role from captive donor to deliberate protector. But commitment did not equate to safety. One morning, after Arya had been fed and was sleeping peacefully, Leora was making her usual careful inspection of the nursery. This room, unlike the grand, mournful queen's suite, was brightly lit and furnished with modern, child-friendly equipment, a small island of normalcy in the ancient castle. Leora's daily ritual involved checking the temperature, the air quality, and the security seals on the thick, leaded windows. As she reached into the crib to adjust the embroidered blanket, her fingers brushed against something hard and sharp nestled deep in the folds of the mattress protector. Leora froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pulled her hand back slowly, then reached in again, carefully pinching the object between her thumb and forefinger. It was a shard of glass, roughly triangular and wickedly sharp, about an inch long. It was not from the window. The glass was different, thicker, slightly smoked. If Arya had wriggled just a little, or if Leora had been less meticulous, the shard could have sliced the baby's tender skin, or worse, been swallowed. The color rushed from Leora's face, leaving her feeling the dizzying emptiness of the previous day, amplified 100-fold by pure, parental terror. This was not an accident. This was deliberate malice. She didn't call for a guard. She didn't ring the bell for Madame Kostia. Clenching the glass shard so tightly it drew a bead of her own blood, Leora stormed out of the nursery and marched straight to the king's study, a restricted area she had never dared approach before. She didn't knock. She threw the heavy oak door open. Eric was sitting behind a massive desk carved with the violin crest, surrounded by stacks of ancient scrolls and modern holographic displays. He looked up, his expression a mixture of surprise and cold annoyance at the interruption. "Leora, you do not have permission." She cut him off, walking directly to his desk and slamming the piece of glass down on the mahogany surface, the sound sharp and final. "Someone tried to kill your daughter," she said, her voice shaking not with fear, but with white-hot rage. This was in her crib. It was not an accident. It was hidden. Eric's mask of composure shattered. He stared at the glass, then at Leora's trembling, bloodied hand. Without a word, he rose, moving with a speed that blurred. He snatched up the shard, examined it under the light, and his eyes, typically a soft red in the lamplight, deepened to the color of spilled wine. "It is smoked glass, used only in the oldest ceremonial drinking vessels," he muttered, his voice dangerously low. "It must have been planted by a member of the inner court." He paced the room twice, his frustration palpable. "I had the manor swept, the staff vetted. Casimir was supposed to assure security was absolute. Casimir is useless if the threat is inside the walls." Leora cried, crossing her arms over her chest. "She is the heir to your throne, and someone wants her dead because she is half-human. You told me the blood was the only thing that mattered, but it's the bloodline they hate." She stood her ground, demanding his attention. "If you think I'm going to stay here and be a simple blood bag while assassins sneak into the nursery, you are wrong, Eric. You need to tell me who they are and what the real stakes are. I am the shield, remember? I need to know how to use myself." Eric stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression slowly shifting from anger to something akin to respect. He gestured to 2 chairs by the fireplace. "The political reality is precisely as you suspect, Leora," he conceded, taking his own seat with weary gravity. "The vampire world is not unified. My marriage to Isabella, a human, broke centuries of tradition. Our most powerful rival, Lord Thorne, heads the Pure Blood Council, a faction that believes mixing bloodlines dilutes our strength and makes us vulnerable." He steepled his fingers, the firelight catching the ruby ring on his hand. "They saw Isabella's death as divine justice. Arya, the damper heir, is an abomination in their eyes. Her existence is the single greatest threat to their ideology, and thus, their power. They believe that if Arya is eliminated, I will be forced to marry a pure-blood consort, and the old order will be restored." Leora shivered, but the fear was now edged with a cold determination. "So, you're not just protecting a baby. You're fighting a civil war. And I'm standing between the enemy and the king's weakness." "Precisely," Eric admitted. "You are valuable, but that makes you a secondary target. You saved her life once, but you are still just a human mother." "Then stop treating me like just a human mother," Leora challenged, leaning forward. "You gave me your blood. I am stronger, I can see things I shouldn't, and I have a maternal rage that will burn this entire castle down before I let anyone touch her. I am not leaving, but I am done being helpless. I want to know who the enemy is. I want to learn this castle. And I want to be trained to defend myself and Arya against anything you can't get to first. Eric stared at her, his surprise genuine. He saw not the weary, pale woman who had collapsed on the floor days ago, but a fierce, revitalized warrior, her eyes blazing with a maternal fire stronger than any ancient magic. He had sought a wet nurse, a biological resource. He had found a guardian, hardened by his own blood and driven by a desperate love for his child. A slow, predatory smile finally curved the king's lips. You demand much, Leora Vale. I demand survival for your daughter, she countered. I am Arya's shield. It's time you taught me how to hold it. Eric stood up, approaching her slowly. Very well. Casimir will begin your self-defense instruction tomorrow. And I, Leora, will teach you the weaknesses of the Pure Blood Council. You may be human, but you're the only thing they never anticipated. Leora's training began immediately, harsh and relentless. Casimir was an unforgiving instructor, treating her less like a queen-to-be and more like a recruit with a severe handicap. Every punch, every block, every lesson on the vulnerability of the vampire neck was taught with a chilling realism that underscored the danger she now faced. She was exhausted, bruised, and constantly on edge, but the rigorous schedule kept her mind from dwelling on her fear and focused on her role as Arya's shield. The king, however, seemed to want to train her in more subtle warfare. He began to invite her to study late in the evenings, not for nursing Arya, but for whispered lessons on the hierarchy of the Pure Blood Council and the history of the Violent House. During these sessions, the bond created by his blood would sometimes flare, giving her flashes of his past emotions, the cold solitude of eternal life, the strategic calculation of a monarch, and, most frequently, the profound, agonizing ache of loss. It was this lingering sorrow that eventually led Leora to seek out the one true ghost in the castle, Isabella, the late queen. One afternoon, while Casimir was delayed, Leora used her newly granted, limited access codes to find the oldest, most restricted wing of the manor, the formal galleries. She knew Eric kept the king's public portrait there, but she was looking for the queen's. She found it in a deep, velvet-draped chamber. The painting was immense, dominating the wall. It depicted Isabella not in state robes, but in a simple white gown, laughing, seated in that same sun-drenched garden Leora had glimpsed in Eric's memory. Isabella's beauty was striking, but what caught Leora was the spirit, that same defiant, radiant energy that seemed entirely too human for the vampire world. The resemblance to Leora was spiritual, not physical, but it was haunting. Both women shared the original blood and the fierce, terrestrial vitality that now anchored the Violin dynasty. Leora stood there for a long time, feeling less like a replacement and more like an echo. Are you comparing yourself to her, Leora? Eric's voice, cold and sharp as splintered ice, cut through the quiet of the gallery. He had tracked her. Leora spun around, instantly defensive. No. I'm trying to understand the target on my back. I'm trying to see the woman you lost. He approached the painting, his eyes fixed on Isabella's laughing face. His grief was a tangible, invisible force that filled the room. You will never understand, he said, his voice raw. Isabella was the light in the shadow. She embraced the world I offered her, but she never bowed to it. She was my equal. And I'm just your source, Leora finished, the words stinging with hurt. I know that. You make it clear every day. But you're asking me to risk my life, her life, to protect your daughter. I need to know why Isabella was worth the risk, and why I'm suddenly worth keeping alive. Eric turned from the painting, his eyes blazing with the same angry red they had on the plane. Do not assume that because you carry the same blood, you carry the same heart, he snapped. I mourn her every century. Do not cheapen that by making yourself a substitute. The air thickened with tension. It was an argument fueled by attraction he couldn't acknowledge and guilt she couldn't escape. Leora had seen his pain through his blood, and he resented her for knowing his weakness. "I am not replacing her," Leora fired back, stepping closer. "I am saving her daughter. That makes me family, Eric. Not a replacement, but a continuation. You need to accept that Arya is growing up with me now, not with a ghost." Before the argument could escalate, a small, gurgling sound echoed from the high-tech listening device Leora carried on her belt, a dedicated monitor for the nursery. The sound was followed by a soft, clear syllable. "Mama." Both Eric and Leora froze. It couldn't be. Arya was only 7 months old, and damper infants rarely spoke before their first year. Eric snatched the monitor from Leora, holding it to his ear with trembling hands. A moment later, the monitor produced another, clearer sound. "Mama." Arya's first word. And it was for Leora. Eric's face, usually the epitome of control, crumpled with a complex emotion Leora couldn't decipher, a mixture of awe, devastating grief, and reluctant, overwhelming acceptance. He slowly lowered the monitor, his gaze returning to Leora. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound vulnerability. He looked not like a king, but like a father who had just witnessed a miracle he didn't deserve. "She has claimed you," he whispered, the earlier insult forgotten. "The bond, it is solidifying. She knows you as her mother." Leora felt a warm surge of protective love, the completion of the contract. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a quiet, fierce joy. She didn't need his permission or his recognition. Arya had given it to her. Eric looked at the portrait of Isabella, then back at Leora. The argument had broken a dam. "I apologize, Leora," he said, his voice rough. It was the first sincere apology she had received from him. "I did not mean to diminish your role. It is simply difficult for me to allow closeness. You are not a replacement. You are the second great love of her short life, and I am grateful for that." He stepped closer, reaching out. His touch was no longer cold or assessing. It was warm and hesitant as he gently brushed a strand of hair back from her temple. "The fear of losing you, the fear of losing the source, it has been making me cruel. Forgive me." The vulnerability was intoxicating. Leora looked up at the king, seeing past the velvet coat and the ancient crown to the man who needed her, not just for his child's blood, but for his own fragile heart. The raw, sensual tension between them, long suppressed by necessity and grief, finally ignited. Leora didn't pull away. She allowed him to stand close, their breaths mingling in the silent gallery. The romantic spark, born of shared risk and the primal bond with Arya, had finally flared into flame. The winter solstice ball was the most significant event in the Violin calendar, a mandatory gathering of the entire vampire court and the ultimate display of the king's power. It was also the night Eric chose for Arya's formal presentation to the Pureblood Council, the faction he knew was plotting the heir's destruction. Leora felt like an impostor dressed in a gown of heavy, midnight blue silk, a gift from Eric, which was exquisite but felt more like armor than attire. Her self-defense training with Casimir had been brutal, but the emotional turmoil of her growing bond with Eric, punctuated by those intense, shared glances and near kisses in the study, had been more taxing. Tonight, she carried a confidence born not of royal status, but of pure, maternal intent. She was here to prove that her baby was thriving and untouchable. Eric met her at the top of the grand staircase. He wore black formal robes and the Violin crown, looking utterly untouchable and magnificent. His gaze, however, was for her alone. "You look formidable," he murmured, taking her arm. The cold, familiar chill of his skin against hers now felt like an anchor. "Stay close. This room is full of enemies pretending to be allies." The great hall was overwhelming. Hundreds of vampires, arrayed in finery that glittered like frozen stars, mingled under chandeliers that illuminated the cavernous space. Their collective presence was heavy, ancient, and judgmental. The music was a deep, melancholic classical score, perfectly suited to the Gothic setting. Leora carried Arya, who was swaddled in ivory lace, looking perfectly healthy and alert. The sight of the damper air immediately silenced the chattering crowd. Every eye in the hall tracked their progress toward the raised dais where the council waited. The council, composed of 5 ancient vampires, sat in judgment. At the center sat Lord Thorn, a figure of archaic power, his silver hair pulled back severely, his expression a mask of contempt. Eric stepped forward, presenting Arya to the court. "My loyal subjects, behold Arya Violin, the daughter of Isabella and your king. She is robust, thriving, and stands as proof that the Violin line will continue through all generations, regardless of the blood that flows." A ripple of uncomfortable whispers spread through the room. It was Thorn's moment to strike. "She appears well-fed, your majesty," Thorn's voice boomed, sharp and disdainful, "thanks to the efforts of your human chattel." He gestured dismissively toward Leora. "Surely the House of Violin has found a sustainable, less animalistic source than a mortal wet nurse?" The insult was brutal and public, aimed not just at Leora's status, but at her very humanity, and by extension, at Arya's half-humanity. A murmur of agreement ran through the pure-blood faction. Leora felt her blood rush with anger, but Eric's arm tightened on hers, a warning. "Lord Thorn," Eric replied, his voice calm but imbued with lethal power. "You speak of blood. You forget the nature of my late queen's sacrifice. This human, Leora Vale, possesses the golden blood, the rarest life force in all creation. She has succeeded where all your vampire remedies failed. She has done what none of your pure-blood subjects could accomplish. She saved the royal heir." Eric then did the unthinkable. He turned to Leora, his red eyes filled with a fierce, possessive certainty, and addressed the entire court. "Leora Vale is no chattel. By right of life-giving, by the bond of the golden blood, and by my royal decree, she is hereby granted the title of Guardian of the Blood." He placed a hand firmly on Leora's shoulder, a signal of ownership and protection. "She is under my direct command, and any disrespect shown to her is an act of treason against the throne. You are all reminded, you do not touch the king's weakness, nor his strength." The silence that followed was total, broken only by the crackling fire in the hearth. Eric hadn't just defended her. He had formally elevated her status from prisoner to protector, forcing the entire court to recognize her as an official part of the ruling power structure. Leora looked up at Eric, seeing the dangerous calculation in his eyes. He had just leveraged their bond to secure his throne. But Thorn's eyes, fixed on Leora, no longer held mere contempt. They held absolute, murderous malice. Eric's declaration had not shielded Leora. It had painted a massive, glowing target on her back, confirming her as the key obstacle to the pure-blood cause. Thorn rose from his seat, a flicker of pure hatred in his ancient eyes. "A guardian, your majesty? A disposable human? Very well. Let us hope, for the sake of the succession, that this new guardian proves more resilient than the last queen." The implication, that Isabella had failed because she was human, was a final, crushing blow. Eric's gaze narrowed, but before he could respond, a flash of red light from the ballroom's corner caught Leora's eye. A discreet message was blinking on a device held by one of Thorn's most devoted guards. "Target confirmation. Guardian must be removed. Tonight." The Winter Solstice Ball had just become a hunting ground. The Winter Solstice Ball shattered exactly 37 minutes after Eric declared Leora the Guardian of the Blood. A sudden, violent tremor shook Violin Manor. Outside, the brewing snowstorm exploded into a blizzard, a whiteout that instantly enveloped the castle. Then, the lights died. Not a flickering blackout, but a complete, absolute cessation of all light and power. The opulent Great Hall was plunged into suffocating darkness, broken only by the crimson glow of hundreds of agitated vampire eyes and the eerie, cold reflection of the snowstorm visible through the enormous arched windows. Panic erupted. The disciplined court dissolved into chaos, the ancient creatures hissing and shouting in the dark. Eric's reaction was immediate and terrifyingly efficient. He shoved Leora toward the nearest exit, thrusting Arya into her arms. "The nursery." "Now," he commanded, his voice slicing through the din. "What is happening?" Leora shouted over the rising din. "Thorn," Eric snarled, drawing a long, silver-hilted blade from beneath his coat. "It's a coup." He used the storm to mask an EMP or sabotage the main generator. "The wards are down. Get to the nursery. Barricade yourself. Do not, under any circumstances, open that door. And you." "I am the king," he said, already moving toward the dais where Thorn had stood. "I contain the contagion. Go." Leora didn't hesitate. Clutching Arya tightly, she dodged panicked figures and raced through the labyrinthine corridors. The sophisticated security systems, the pressure plates, the biometric locks, were all dead. The manor was a vast, unguarded tomb. She reached the royal nursery wing, its heavy oak door standing open, security lights dark. She slammed the door shut and slid the two massive manual bolts she had often noticed on the inside, redundant protection meant for centuries past, now their only defense. The nursery was dark and silent save for Arya's soft breathing and the frantic pulse Leora could feel hammering in her own throat. The ambient cold intensified. Leora quickly moved furniture, pushing the heavy, carved feeding table and a massive velvet armchair against the door. The defense was flimsy, but it bought them time. I'm here, sweet girl," Leora whispered, rocking Arya against her chest. "Mama is here." From the floor below, she heard the first sounds of conflict, the sharp metallic shing of silver hitting stone, followed by guttural snarls and the sickening sound of bodies hitting the marble floor. Eric was fighting. Leora knew the assassins wouldn't waste time on the king. Thorn's true objective was the heir and the guardian. If the Pure Blood Council could eliminate Arya and Leora, Eric would be left without a successor or a sustainable source, politically castrated and open to full siege. She paced the small, bright room, now dark and utterly vulnerable. Casimir's training flashed through her mind. Look for the blind spot. Use leverage. Do not let them get close to the neck. She found the silver letter opener Eric used for state documents, the one engraved with the Violin crest, and gripped it tightly. Outside the door, the muffled sounds of combat grew closer, more focused. The fighting was moving up the stairs. Then, a sound that froze Leora's blood, a sharp thump against the oak door, followed by a heavy, deliberate scraping sound as someone tried the handle. "Miss Vale," a smooth, cultured voice called out from the hallway. "Do not be foolish. The king is preoccupied. It is over." It was Lord Thorn. He hadn't deployed assassins. He had come himself. "You can't get in." Leora yelled back, her voice shaking but defiant. "The king's precious bolts are a charming throwback, but they are wood," Thorn replied, amusement coloring his voice. "And you, my dear, are merely human. Your blood may be golden, but your defenses are glass." Arya stirred in Leora's arms, sensing the danger. Leora placed her carefully in the crib, whispering reassurances. A moment later, a sickening crack split the air as the first bolt splintered. Leora knew the furniture wouldn't hold against vampire strength. She scrambled across the room, desperately looking for an alternative. She remembered the storage closet where the cleaners kept their supplies. A heavy brass mop handle, perhaps? Anything. She wrenched the closet door open and snatched the first metal object she could reach, a long, heavy silver candelabra, ornate and solid. Crack. The second bolt gave way, tearing the wood around the doorframe. The barricaded furniture scraped loudly against the floor as the door was shoved inward an inch. Through the crack, Leora saw an ancient, pale hand, its nails sharp and dark, gripping the edge of the door. Thorn began to push the furniture aside, slowly, inevitably. Leora stood between the crib and the door, the heavy silver candelabra raised above her head, her human heart pounding a death rhythm against her ribs. She was the guardian of the blood, and this was the end of her watch. The door burst open, knocking the armchair aside. Lord Thorn stood framed in the dim, snow-lit doorway, his face twisted into a triumphant snarl. He was alone, but his presence was overwhelming, radiating contempt and ancient power. Such defiance, Thorn sneered, stepping over the wreckage. So pathetic. The damper filth will die first, then the human shield. You should never have interfered, peasant. He moved with blinding speed toward the crib. Leora reacted on instinct, forgetting everything Casimir had taught her about technique and striking with the pure, adrenaline-fueled rage of a cornered mother. She lunged forward, swinging the silver candelabra in a wide, desperate arc. Lord Thorn was too focused on the crib, too contemptuous of the human chattel, to anticipate the strength Leora now possessed. The tonic Eric had forced into her system, the concentrated vampire alchemy, had done more than just stabilize her. It had supercharged her human adrenaline, giving her a burst of speed and power that defied her mortal limits. She swung the heavy silver candelabra, aiming for the head, but Thorn, reacting to the glint of the metal, raised an arm to block. The impact was still devastating. The silver, toxic to vampires, struck Thorn's forearm with a sickening crack, shattering the bone and making the ancient vampire hiss in pain and surprise. "Insolent fool!" Thorn roared, his eyes glowing red with fury. He lashed out, his hand snapping toward Leora's throat, but Casimir's voice echoed in her memory. "Never let them get close to the neck." Leora ducked low, dropping the candelabra, and rolled under the outstretched arm. Thorn, now seriously wounded and enraged, turned back to his primary target, Arya. He lunged toward the crib. But Leora was faster. Her hand flew to the small, familiar weight clipped inside her waistband, the silver letter opener, Isabella's heirloom, which she had taken from the study after the glass shard incident. It was not a weapon, but it was silver and it was sharp. With a final, desperate surge of maternal adrenaline, Leora threw herself onto Thorn's back, wrapping her legs around his waist, pinning his damaged arm. She didn't aim for the chest, which she knew was hardened and protected. She aimed for the face. She brought the letter opener up and, with a silent scream of pure, visceral rage, plunged the silver tip deep into the soft, unprotected tissue of Thorn's right eye. Thorn's scream was deafening, a primal, raw shriek of agony that ripped through the silent manor. Silver was poison, and the eye, the organ of the vampire's supernatural sight, was a profound vulnerability. He stumbled backward, violently thrashing to dislodge the mortal weight on his back. Leora clung on until Thorn crashed against the marble wall, the impact throwing her clear across the room. She landed hard, the air knocked from her lungs, but she immediately scrambled back to her feet, instinctively placing herself between the wounded monster and Arya's crib. Thorn ripped the silver opener from his face, bellowing as dark, iridescent black blood streamed down his cheek. He was crippled, blinded in one eye and temporarily paralyzed by the agony, but he was far from defeated. "You will die for that, human," he shrieked, raising his left hand, his fingers elongating into claws sharp enough to shred stone. As Thorn lunged, a sudden, blinding flash of silver light erupted in the doorway, followed by the sound of something impossibly fast tearing through the air. Eric Violin appeared, a whirlwind of velvet and fury. He was covered in the black blood of his defeated guards and his own enemies, his silver blade dripping. He took in the scene in a single, searing glance, Leora, bloodied and defiant, standing over the crib, and Thorn, roaring in pain and blinded by the silver. Eric did not pause. There was no negotiation, no trial, no hesitation. This was the king enacting justice for a direct assault on his heir and his chosen guardian. With a sound like ripping silk, Eric closed the distance. He drove his silver blade, not into Thorn's heart, but through his spine, pinning him to the stone wall. Thorn gurgled, his eyes wide in a final, agonizing expression of shock and betrayal. "You tried to harm my daughter." Eric's voice was a low, resonant growl, vibrating with ancient power. "You tried to harm her mother. You challenged the blood. For this, Thorn, you die without mercy and without rest." Eric wrenched the blade free, and Thorn slid down the wall, collapsing into a heap of expensive velvet and cooling black blood. The most powerful political enemy of the Violin dynasty was dead. The silence that followed was absolute, punctuated only by Leora's ragged gasps and the soft, innocent breathing of Arya in the crib. Eric turned, his eyes searching the darkness for Leora. He dropped the dripping blade to the floor and crossed the room in 2 strides. He stopped, not touching her, but surveying the scene, the smashed door, the wrecked furniture, Leora's torn clothes, and the dark blood smeared on her face. Leora stood rigid, clutching the side of the crib, covered in the viscous, alien blood, but her eyes never left Arya. "Arya," Eric choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "She's fine," Leora managed, her voice a strained whisper. "She's sleeping." Eric stepped past Thorn's lifeless body, placed his hands on Leora's shoulders, and pulled her gently away from the crib. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He simply leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. "You saved her," he whispered, the king's voice broken by a father's relief. "You saved us both. You are everything I hoped you would be." Leora, finally allowing the adrenaline to recede, collapsed against him, her exhaustion immense, but her spirit victorious. She was not just a shield, she was the architect of the king's victory. The hours following the defeat of Lord Thorn were a blur of cold efficiency and swift, silent justice. The blizzard raged outside, sealing the manor off from the world as Eric enacted the brutal necessity of a political purge. Those who had allied with Thorn, those who had hesitated when the king was in danger, and those who had messages on their phones proving their intention to intercept the royal heir were dealt with by Casimir and Eric's loyalists. The council was swiftly cleansed, the pure-blood supremacist faction neutralized in the silent, terrifying hours of the solstice night. Leora recovered not in her luxurious, but haunted suite, but in the sterile quiet of the manor's private hospital wing. Her injuries were mercifully superficial, mostly bruises and a severe shock, but the physical exhaustion from the continuous drain and the trauma of the fight had taken a profound toll. Eric Violin never left her side. He sat by her bed, not giving commands or reviewing state documents, but watching her with an intense, quiet devotion. He fed her the restorative tonic himself, ensuring the perfect dosage, and when the pain in her ribs was at its worst, he offered his own blood, this time without coercion, administered through a small, elegant silver dropper. The blood no longer felt alien. It felt like salvation, familiar and necessary. The psychic link was now permanent. Leora saw flashes of his relief, his self-reproach over putting her in danger, and his burgeoning, unstoppable love for her. "You should be resting, overseeing the cleanup," Leora rasped one afternoon, her voice weak. Eric gently wiped her forehead with a cool cloth. "The realm can wait. The realm is secure. But I almost lost my guardian. I almost lost the reason I fought." He paused, taking her hand, a simple, human gesture that felt more intimate than any embrace. "I must confess something, Leora. When I brought you here, I saw you only as a necessary resource. A miracle, yes, but a resource nonetheless. I told myself I was honoring Isabella's memory by seeking only to preserve Arya." He squeezed her hand, his cold touch sending a tremor through her. "But when I burst into that room and saw you standing over Thorn, bloodied but undefeated, holding the silver, ready to die for her, I realized the truth. You are not a resource. You are a co-creator. His red eyes, now soft and solemn, met hers. Isabella gave me life. You gave me hope. You fought for Arya not because of a contract, but because she is yours. You embraced the weakness of my half-breed heir and turned it into strength. She is my daughter, Leora affirmed simply, the words the purest truth she knew. And you are my equal, Eric stated, the title sounding heavier than the crown itself. He rose, walking to the window, watching the last of the blizzard melt from the glass. He turned back, the king once more, but this time, the king offering his entire world. The 30-day contract is void, he declared. I cannot send you home, Leora. Arya's stability relies on your continued presence, and my throne relies on your protection. Moreover, I rely on you. I love you. Not as a substitute for Isabella, but as the fiery, strong woman who stood against a millennium of tradition for the sake of one child. He walked back to the bed and knelt beside her, a king bowing low. I ask you to replace the contract with a covenant. I ask you to become the next Queen of Violin. Not as a consort or a puppet, but as the official mother of the night, co-ruler and permanent guardian of the blood. Leora looked at the man who was both her captor and her champion. She thought of her difficult, single life back in New York, the endless struggle, the loneliness. She thought of the love in Arya's small, red eyes and the connection she shared with this ancient, grieving king. She wasn't accepting a crown, she was accepting a family. A place to belong, where her own rare blood made her the most powerful person in the room. I accept, she whispered, a slow smile gracing her lips. Not for the crown, Eric, but for Arya. And for the home we will build. The following night, they held a small, private coronation ceremony in the restored Great Hall, consecrated by the loyal members of the new council. Leora wore the midnight blue gown again, standing beside Eric as he placed a simple, elegant diadem of silver and moonstone upon her head. The final image was captured by the hushed admiration of the court. Leora sat on the throne next to Eric, holding a sleeping Arya against her shoulder. The camera lights caught the queen's eyes, and in the reflection, they were not the warm brown of a human mother, but a startling, beautiful amber, shot through with threads of red. The vampire alchemy had worked its final magic. The golden blood, now perpetually replenished by the king's own vitality and enhanced by the tonic, had granted Leora a gift. She was no longer merely human. She was eternal, the perfect mate and the perfect shield, the mother of the night and the true foundation of the new Violin dynasty.